Well, just chance for the end.
Well, I approach all of this very much from the position of a non-continental historian, as I'm an English local historian, with a bias towards looking at pre-Reformation and pre-Renaissance England. And the first thing that strikes me, coming out of Peter's paper, from which I'd like to widen out a little bit, is can we get behind the Renaissance symbolism used by the elites, which seems to be imposed, if you like, on the form of the Carnival, and to ask a general question whether or not we're looking at accretions to popular culture rather than the manufacture of new forms. Have we got a substratum which goes back to heavens knows when, but on which new forms are imposed? There seem to be two major problems about this, looking at it. The first one is a documentary one, and I would wish, I think, to see more contemporary detail, detail which emanates from the documentation produced by insiders, rather than the comment of outsiders and foreigners, so that we can attempt to reconstruct from within what actually was going on. And also to ask whether or not we can probe a bit to what may perhaps lie behind. And in doing so, perhaps one comes up against the danger of turning into a folklorist, but I think one has to face that danger. Now, there obviously is a definitional problem here, for the discussion has emphasized, I think earlier on, very much the social structural aspect of things. And I think I would wish to see a definition which expanded Julian Pitt-Rivers' definition, so that somehow or other we had ritual doing something which relates society to what each culture takes to be the otherworldly, which is something rather more than just looking at social relations and looking beyond that. Now, in this sense, what lies behind what actually goes on in a situation like Carnival obviously is very important. And I want just to concentrate essentially on one aspect of this, and to ask whether we can perceive blocks of ritual time, sacred time, as it were. Now, it seems to me that there are two aspects to this in European society. There is a so-called Celtic division of the year, which goes from November to May, which is the one that Guha relies upon. And there is a second one, which is common in England and which can be paralleled in many cases on the continent, where you have a rather more complete integration of Christian liturgical activity, particularly activity related to the birth, life, death and resurrection of Christ, and popular customs, all of which, or many of which, fall into a block of time between Christmas and Midsummer. Now, if this is the case, and there is a distinction to be made between a block of highly ritualized time and the rest of the year, the other half of the year, in which there is less ritual activity, it may well be that what we look at in these blocks of time, the ritual blocks of time, take on a rather different significance to those that take place outside those blocks of time. Now, it seems to me that there is a tendency to cluster popular and sacred rituals into these seasons, and I'm thinking particularly of the one that stretches from Christmas to Midsummer. And I suggest that it may be possible to see some kind of logical structure, as it were, between the rituals that take place within that block of time, whereby different rituals complement each other, involving different groups or groupings within society which come into relationship with each other in a ritual context. And I wonder, therefore, whether we can't see Carnival in this context. And to pick up Peter's many points in some respects, first of all, there's Carnival as a period, obviously, of confusion, and the point that was made by Professor Ranger earlier on about confusion, Carnival is a period of conflict, and the point made by Professor Ranger about confusion, I think, is very relevant here. I wonder whether it's accidental that this is so often tied down to Tuesday, in French mardi, and here we have, I bring a folkloric point in here, Tuesday after all is the Germanic god of war, Tu, and mardi is the classical equivalent Mars, And there are many situations of conflict which happen particularly on Tuesdays, interestingly enough, I think, anyway, in England. In the context of Carnival, in this period of confusion, one wonders whether one ought to be relating it, therefore, to this longer block of time, seeing it as both sort of anti-structure and even anti-ritual in its form. Secondly, Carnival, it seems to me, does involve the whole of society. It builds up, certainly, as Peter says, obviously from sub-districts and guilds, and even from youth groups, to involving the whole of society. And perhaps this might be contrasted with the other ritualistic activities that occur within the 6-month period of time, which presumably, more usually, either involve the subgroups within society or illustrate only one aspect of society, like the sacred at the Feast of Corpus Christi. Finally, in this connection, Carnival, if it is involving the whole of society, is logically centrally staged in the piazza, as in contrast to the activities involving the subgroups within society who may be concentrating their activities much more at the level of the parish or the ward or the street. And this does bring society together in this context of time and contrast it at Carnival with these other activities during that block of time. Now, there's a final wider point which I would like to try and bring out of this, and that is to do with the distribution of Carnival, about which we don't seem to know very much. What strikes me, looking at things from the English point of view, is that the absence of Carnival in England is very noticeable. I don't think we can take the single customs, like throwing at cocks, for example, which one can parallel in Peter's evidence, as proof of an earlier, wider activity or observance in this country. I've looked fairly hard for this, and it may well be that others will come up with examples, but the only example that I can find which gets anywhere near is the case of Norwich in 1443 on Fasting Gone Tuesday, which is Shrove Tuesday, when there was a procession with the 12 months of the year, followed by a King of Christmas, who in turn was followed by Lent, draped in red skins. And this apparently was accompanied by people disguised, and plays are referred to. But in England, we have a ritual emphasis which, in terms of involving the wider society as a whole, the times of the year which are most associated with this seem to be, in one case, Christmas, the case of York, which seems to be under the influence of some Scandinavian custom, where there's the custom of Yule and his wife coming into the city, and this is a time of social license. But much more frequent seems to be in the English urban context are the customs associated with midsummer. And again, when one gets to the end of the Middle Ages, one seems to see earlier things being overlaid by demonstrations of authority. But I think there's enough to indicate that in cities like London, Exeter, Bristol, Coventry and Nottingham, where there was a marching watch, quite often brought in, I think, originally to control times of riot, that there was something approaching the carnival atmosphere. Certainly at Salisbury in the 15th century, this was known as the revel. Now, it may well be that this pattern, the absence of carnival in England, and an emphasis on the beginning and end of what I would take to be this sacred block of time, is something which is most common in Northern Europe, Scandinavia and North Germany. I'm open to correction on this. And I wonder whether we might not get a little closer to understanding Carnival if we think about this comparative context, the difference between North and South in this connection. I think perhaps I'm important to know that.
Yes, I'm very much in agreement with Charles that we should think of this in the context of a part of the year where time is heavily ritualized, and I was interested in the Tuan Mars aspect of it. However, I would like to argue that the context of the carnival is very distinctly Christian, and this against the tendency which I noticed in the anthropological writing to see it as a Saturnalian survival something pre-Christian. I'd like to argue that Carnival is essentially a Christian festival. It isn't a feast of love like some other feasts, like Corpus Christi say. Its reference seems very clearly to be to penance, though the reference is mainly by contrast. It's of course, as Peter and everybody said, it's the opposite of Lent. It's the opposite of the penitential season. What's done in Carnival is what is not done in Lent. I think I might put this as strongly as possible as in saying that it seems to me to be a festival of the 7 deadly sins. It seems to me very specifically to be related to the sacrament of penance and to confession. After all, Shrove Tuesday. Shrove is confession, or shriving is confession. I notice in Strutt's thing about English folklore that pancake eating in some farms was a kind of present that ploughmen got after they had been to confession. At least that's how I understood his reference. And I see 2 or 3 consequences of this. I see a liturgical connection. The confession of sins, originally public confession, liturgically should take place at the beginning of Lent and not, as it did at the end of the Middle Ages, at the end. The shifting of the confession of sins from the beginning to the end of Lent was a kind of anti-liturgical movement which was clearly connected with the development of private or auricular confession, which after 1215 the legislation which required annual private confession seems to have taken place in the beginning of Holy Week, but in principle it should have taken place at the beginning of Lent and to have been followed naturally by the penitential season, which will then prepare for the communion of Easter. Now, I was extremely interested in looking at the dictionary evidence that we were given, to see the dating of the word carnival. It seems to appear in the 11th and 12th centuries, and I do note that this is precisely the dating for the passage from a public confession of sins to a private confession of sins, and I would be inclined to offer the hypothesis that the emergence of Carnival is something to do with a sacramental dissociation which has shifted the confession of sins from the beginning of Lent and from the public ritual to the end of Lent and the private one. I would explain on this grounds Peter Bourke's problem about the trial, condemnation and execution of Carnival. He confesses his sins, and I must say, in all the films I saw, that the execution of a person convicted of a ritual object or objective quasi person convicted of sin seemed to me an essential part of the whole operation. I would also interpret the particular illustration we had of the wearing of a sheet as a residue of public penance, and I think a good deal of the animal side of the bulls and pigs would seem to refer to sin and both in the aggressive sense, bulls, and in the sexual or gluttony sense, piece. I'd go on to argue that apart from this liturgical connection, there is a social connection which I find particularly in Julian's discussion of the carnival in his Spanish village. I deduced from what you said that what is essentially brought up at the carnival is the totality of the offences committed in the community in the course of the year, which become the result of the object of public ridicule, satire, objection, and general complaint. Now, I think it is extremely interesting in connection with the sacrament of penance that one thing we do know is that that it was an ingrained habit of the average, certainly rural person, when confronted with the sacrament of penance, to produce other people's sins and not his own. And as this was an annual event, I can't help feeling that there is a distinct connection between this annual bringing up of social faux pas or evils and the popular understanding of the annual confession, or what I've called elsewhere annual settlement of social accounts. I don't want to go on about that, but I think the mask I would interpret as a way of accusing without being known or visible. I think it's interesting, and I would also be inclined to associate the anonymity of the mask with the later anonymity of the confessional, with the in between the priest and the penitent. I'd also treat in this sense the distinct characteristic which I had noticed from several discussions, the absence of privacy which obtained in the carnival. Those who were representing the satire, or as the modern community, were allowed to go anywhere inside, that the whole inside houses, that the whole community was open and exposed to view the dark corners became light. Now, these were the thoughts that I'd had before I saw the film this afternoon. I just add that there is when I thought that, it wasn't clear to me whether one should quite regard the carnival as a mimicry of public confession or as a residue of the absence of it. But I did note Natalie Davis's piece about Chauvar is that mock confession was certainly in some instances in France a common feature of Chauvar. But just finally, what I got from seeing the film, now I thought the French one seemed to me to be a very clear illustration of the kind of thing I was trying to say, and one specific point about the music. Now, when they were going around, there was this band playing, and they were on the lower, and but about halfway through, I began to play a hymn tune, which I know from my upbringing. It's a hymn tune, two words of which I think are worth repeating. I wouldn't wish to sing it in this company. I could do, but it's very mournful and dirge-like. The actual tune is da da dee da 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 dee da da dee da 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 dee da dum, and you go on that. And the words of the first verse anyway are: God of mercy and compassion. Look with pity upon me. Father, let me call thee Father, it is thy child returns to thee. Jesus, Lord, I ask for mercy. Let me not implore in vain. All my sins, I now detest them. Never will I sin again. And it goes on like that. This is obviously an English version, but I think the original would probably have been French. So this tune was produced in a procession, and I rather took it that what they were singing in the actual dance was a kind of mock version of that. I may have been wrong about that, but apart from that, a connection which I thought distinctly significant, the burning of Carnival, which appears both in the French one and in the Spanish ones, the association with sin, which appeared to me in the French one and was specifically made in the kind of Lance for Mysterious Sins, that this figure was accused of. I would, anyway, my impression after seeing the films was that the thoughts I had had before coming seemed to be really confirmed in a surprising way. So I would rather stress the embodiment of the Carnival in the kind of Christian penitential structure.
Is everyone happy with this Christian interpretation of Carnival? If I might offer a comment, I have a contemporary 17th century description of Carnival which seems to fit this interpretation very well. It's described as a feast of 8 days, accompanied with all manner of singing, skipping and dancing and jollity, in which time a perfect lampooning liberty is allowed, and scandal so highly exalted they may freely sing all the faults, villainies and frauds of their superiors, and the only way to stop their mouth is to ply them lustily with drink. The only trouble is that comes from a Dutch account of the coast of Guinea, and there is at least a superficial level in which the phenomenon of Carnival is worldwide, and I wondered how you related this rather localized interpretation. We did, after all, see films of the Christian culture.
Well, I don't. I noticed that in the Indian case that we read, that there did seem to be the same kind of annual accumulation of offences which were being somehow brought up and somehow expiated or dealt with. I don't think really that I have anything to say too ignorant to accept that perhaps all religious rituals being roughly about the same thing will tend to produce roughly the same effects. But
well, I think this is what makes some of the discussion about a general sense, and one has it very much, I think, when one is trying to analyze the relationship between Islamic and pagan rituals in Africa or anywhere else, that these things are about the same kind of things. I think it's very difficult to see confession, for example, as moving from the church into the village or the town, when we know that confession has moved, as it were, from the village into the church in the first place. That is to say, and so it's mock only in a certain sense. It may be mocking something which, in a sense, is already there in the Charivari or in some other modes of this kind, where people are being forced, in a sense, to confess their sins, or else thinking that they can expiate, thinking if they do it voluntarily, they're in some way in some case expiating expiating the sin. I mean, one finds this, for example, in aspects of witchcraft, where people are sort of confessing to things which are enormously improbable there, on the grounds that by speaking this out, they're somehow getting rid of it. So that the idea that confession is expiatory in this way, I mean, isn't simply coming, as it were, from the church, it's also perhaps coming out of a way and being formalized. And if I think, again, that somebody was talking earlier about the question of some aspects of Carnival sort of coming from the elite downwards. This is, again, has been a sort of persistent discussion in folkloristic and other rituals. But certainly, I mean, if certain forms of masks come downwards, the mask also went upwards. I mean, it was formalized in art culture, if you like, and then came back again. I mean, let's take Julian's examples of phony folk, which he has discussed at different times. I mean, you get the sort of steel en pierre bed in the peasant's house, but the steel en pierre bed is itself a sort of formalization of something that was there. Something that was there before. I mean, it's a sort of dialectical process, which makes, I think, it very difficult to, perceive it as coming, perceive anything like this in its totality, anyhow, as coming either from earlier elements, or from later, earlier Celtic elements, or from later ritual ones. These things seem to me to be sort of amalgams at a particular which do have a great tendency to persist simply because they are formalistic in their production. A lot of people are involved in them, and because they're formalistic, it means that they're very susceptible to change of persistence and form and change of meaning. I think this is why some of the problems of interpretation are so problematical, because masks, disguises sort of continue over, persist and persist and persist. And yet they have very different meanings at different times.
I have great sympathy for Mr. Bossy's position, and I don't see that one gets anywhere by avoiding the fact that this is a Christian ritual. In order to put it, there are analytics, presumably, that one wants to develop to see it in relation to others, but each step you take away from the theological context, which gives it its central symbolism and its central meaning, to the active. Many of the things that we're laying onto the Carnival are things that are in our heads. They're in our heads, not necessarily in the heads there. But again, I think part of the elegance of Peter's presentation was his capacity to move from what was a native interpretation in the 14th and 15th century to other kinds of interpretations. I mean, so that I think a Dutchman seeing something on the coast of Guinea in the 17th century, he's telling us about what he sees. We don't know anything about what those people in Guinea were doing. But in a system in which these markers and all of these things are very, very meaningful to people, that seems to me, I agree totally with you, is where you start in understanding it. Whatever else we bring to it is, I won't say it's extra, but that's another activity.
May I say just two things? One, that I think the contrast with Lent is the fundamental fact, it seems to me. And two, I am interested in the dating, and if the linguistic evidence is right, this does not go back before the 11th and 12th century. I think it's extremely interesting and would support my view.
Yes, it was a good convention, derived from the Saturnalia, wasn't it, by Protestant Levists, whom the Romans
realise that, but it seems to me the dating of the word made it rather difficult to support, since there seems to be no use of the word for the 11th century.
What else is the shift in the confessional related to? I wasn't quite clear in your statement whether this is something which is autonomous in relation to the theological system, or whether it indeed comes with a series of other changes which are going on.
Well, the development of private confession goes with the development of scholastic theology in the 12th century.
Does this mean the growth of a more educated laity? greater individualism. Individuality is getting more complicated. Some people, that was a demand for individual confession. And this being so, sort of the social function of confession would be left free-floating, as it were,
Yes,
and might take the... that's what you mean, isn't it? It might mean take the form of a
yes, I feel it is
ritual.
being left free-floating. Yes, that is really much what I was trying to say. Otherwise, I feel I'm not sufficiently an early medieval historian to interpret Italy, except that I am clear on the shift from public to private and the shift from the beginning of Lent to the end of Lent.
And you think that this was imposed on the society by the theologians and the
Private
priests?
confession, yes, I would have thought so, yes.
Just to say, I think we are taking a bend towards particularist interpretations, that is, to try and locate these in specific theological context belonging to Christendom, and thereby sort of whittling down the suggestion that comes from Keith's counterexample. I have a feeling that we have to operate at both levels. We have to certainly seek the particularist explanation in the context of the given society, the given set of beliefs in terms of theology or other forms of ideology. But at the same time, I think it is useful to emphasize, in fact emphasize again and again, the universalistic aspects of rituals. Because if we do not do that, some of the universalistic constructs, like ritual as a rebellion, ritual as forms of protest, ritual as inversion of social relationships, which have been studied from Gluckman's area to Radcliffe Brown's area. All those suggestions are relatively weakened. Therefore, I feel that I should like to emphasize the universalistic aspect of rituals. Of these, taking what you have said and Peter have said, I find 5 aspects. One is the element of vow, element of penance. The earliest reference in Sanskrit texts about an Indian festival goes to a text that was written around 200 AD, and that describes festivals as arising from a pledge on the part of the devotee not to do one thing or the other. It was definitely a negative sort of thing. And then, as medievalist sort of commentators filed in one after the other, you see, over the centuries, this was all turned into positive injunctions and so on and so forth. So we find throughout the whole range of Indian festivals, particularly the brothas, which are called brothas in Sanskrit, and also in vernacular languages today, this element of self-deprivation, either in the form of fasting or in the form of making a sacrifice or in the form of making a gift, that you deprive yourself. In fact, they say the word in Sanskrit is tapas. Tapas means penance, means undertaking something that gives you pain. So I think that element is common. The other elements which are common, and just refer to Peter's intervention in his paper, are 4, as well as Professor Pitt-Rivers have said. I'll take together with 4 others. One is more or less in this order: obscenity. Second, the element of pageant and procession. Third, the element of mock battle. And fourth, the element of sacrifice. I've not ranked this last point, penance, but I have a feeling that one can sort of try and suggest that in most cultures there will be more or less invariably an element of obscenity connected with this carnival type. An element of, coming next to it, element of procession and display, public display, and so on and so forth. Why I want to emphasize this? Because one of the things is that I am interested in looking at rituals as language. And as we all know, structural linguistics has done a lot of very inspired research influenced by Roman Jacobson in search of universals. Jacobson and his disciples have established that there is no language in the world, for instance, which does not have a syllable that starts with a consonant. And there is no language in the world which does not have a syllable that doesn't end with a consonant. And then on grammatical level, they have a construct about syntactic structures, about the, as a function of the relationship of the subject, the verbal predicate and object. Now, some of these universals have proved to be wrong. They are not universals, but on the whole, starting with Jacobson's work through Greenberg up to the work of the Prague structuralists, now we can say that it is scientifically demonstrated that the languages of the world do contain certain universals. I think that a powerful language like that of rituals, particularly rituals of the order that we've discussed, carnivals, do have certain universals. And I would suggest that these five, vow and penance, mock battle, obscenity, sacrifice, and pageants, these five merit consideration. Maybe some of them will have to be modified.
Well, that's an ambitious scheme.
And so we seem to be coming close here to two at least of the possible ways of interaction of history and anthropology. One is to use historical data equally with contemporary ethnographic data to arrive at your universals, sort of modified Levi-Straussian way of doing history. The other is to try to use anthropological insights to illuminate the specifics of a particular period of time when it's much less useful to say that what one is looking at in Carnival in Spain is a manifestation of universal structures, I think. Or at least the more successful you are at unlaying the universal structures, the less interesting it becomes each time to discover them, if you see what I mean. I think the dispute, insofar as it is a dispute between Jack Goody and John Bossy, is not so much about the question of the atmosphere of these things by the time you reach the 16th century, because what Jack was saying perfectly readily admits that by this time they're in a Christian context and gain significance through Christian theology. It's largely a question of whether or not you're going to press hard on your notion of the origin of these things. And since at the moment, so far as I understand it, our data on that must be purely speculative.
Well,
it seems more
linguistic at the moment out of the dictionary.
Yes, and that's not very good data, is it? Because the dictionary record is presumably the first time they've discovered this word in use in a print context or in a manuscript context. But in any case, it seems more sensible to concentrate upon what Jack was suggesting there, the various ways in which these common elements can be integrated, and you rightly pointed out that they are very effectively integrated in an overall manner into the pattern of the Christian interpretation. I would like to say two further things. One is that Professor Cohn says that this is what gives them meaning. I would agree that this is what gives them an overall meaning, but I'd like to revert to the point I made this morning, that within that overall meaning there are a multiplicity of smaller meanings, and we haven't got nearly as far as we need to go merely by saying that this is the meaning of Carnival. The second is I'd like to express a rather Philistine unhappiness about your block of sacred time. It seems a hell of a big block. You say things that happen in sacred time are different from things that don't. We've got 6 months of the year for your block of sacred time. It begins...
I would have extended it to All Saints too.
Well, quite so. That's the other point about it. Is that really the effective block of sacred time? And you've got a run into Christmas, haven't you, as well as a run out of it. I really don't find that very persuasive, I must say.
Yes, well, I couldn't really elaborate on this in any detail, but I willingly admit that I'm extrapolating very much from what I see as happening in England. But I think it's perfectly possible to see the vast majority of high ritual activities actually occurring in this block of time. There is, in some places, a short run into Christmas, which may be the 21st of December. But Advent as a whole, in terms of ritual activities, doesn't seem to involve a great deal. But there does seem to be a connection between the number of church observances involving high ritual, popular holidays, periods of license, even, I think, a certain element of continuity in the symbolism which one can perceive in use at this time, which, when attached to the movable nature of Easter, the fact that it can be either early or late, so that when it is at its earliest, it can start 2 days after Candlemas, which is the last day of Christmas, and those 2 days, of course, are the Shrovetide days, and when it's at its latest, the Feast of Corpus Christi coincides with Midsummer Day. I think one can put forward quite a strong argument to suggest that that period of time has an unusual character. It's quite different in liturgical terms because it's concerned very much with the life story, death story of Christ, whereas after that you have succession of Trinity Sundays and the rest, and a few scattered moments certainly, but there is no continuity, and nor do you find extended popular holidays in that second half of the year.
When you have 6 months of the year as sacred time, which is the usual,
when I'm saying, I mean, one has to use sort of shorthand terms here. I'm not saying that when people are toiling away that they think they're in sacred time. I merely mean that when ritual actually occurs during this period of time, I suspect it has a different quality to what takes place at the other times of the year. It seems to be much more ritual activity in England.
But surely I'd like to know a precise definition of the question we are arguing. Is it being contested that there is a concept of sacred time as against non-sacred time or secular time, or is it being contested that the span that has just been suggested to be sacred time, 6 months or so a year, is too long or too short? Because I think we need to get this clear, because obviously this is very basic. What would you be suggesting?
It's the second I'm unhappy about.
That is
I
true.
don't want to be unhappy about the first at this particular moment.
Does the English period of sacred time quite fit into the Christian scheme? Because it finishes at midsummer, doesn't it?
Yes, but
St. John's Day,
yes.
mostly.
But as I say, by the time you've got the Feast of Corpus Christi, which is actually the climax of the Easter cycle, which is attached, it's the last feast attached to the movability of Easter. That, when Easter is at its latest, coincides with Midsummer Day, rather deliberately, I must suspect, I think.
How exactly does mumming fit into the English ritual scene? This seems to have many points of contact with Carnival, and yet it isn't like it in many ways. I mean, mumming takes place at the turning points, the usual turning points at Epiphany and Shrovetide, Whitsun and Midsummer. It consists of disguised bands of people running through the streets in the City of London, for example, or sometimes running through churches, encircling the churches. Sometimes they wear bells, like those people we saw on the film. They don't insult the Virgin, but in the Reformation context, sometimes they interrupt the preacher. In the City of London, mumming takes a very interesting form, I think, because these disguised people break into the houses of the citizens. Very often the practice is forbidden for this reason. What they do is insist on playing dice with them. However, the dice is always loaded in favour of the mummers, so they always win. In other words, it's surely an inversionary right. You've got the inversionary element present. Fortune favours the citizens, the rich normally, but on this particular occasion, the poor comes to fortune is so sort of fixed, as it were, to favour the poor. And these bands, beyond this action of playing dice, now the thing which it seems to me makes mumming different from a carnival. Carnival always involves the people participating. They mingle with the general public, don't they? Am I right in that? What do you call them? The masked people and so on. In one way or another, they have relations with the spectators and so on. So the carnival is, in some ways, a rite of solidarity. But English mummers they never say anything. They never mingle, they just come and they go. So that when, for example, mumming becomes a court rite, the disguising, this still continues to be an aspect of it. And lords come in, they dance, they go out again. And that's the rite. So that it's an other world breaking in on the ordinary world in some kind of way. But on the other hand, this doesn't seem to be at all Christian, does it?
And it happens to be rather nice at the key points of my block of sacred time, isn't it?
Yeah.
But I think that comes back to a point that I was making earlier, that in England I don't think one could wish to generalise from single customs, which might survive or be mentioned, to the wider observance of Carnival. It seems to me we are faced with a problem here, the areas of Europe where Carnival doesn't seem to have been practised. I don't know where one draws the line, to be quite honest, but that seems to be certainly the one where it's Scandinavia, I think.
You mentioned there that it was largely in southern countries rather than northern ones.
Feeling I have.
I had a feeling that you were connecting this with some sort of Celtic tradition, rather than the fact that it's then going to be out of doors that Shrove Tuesday.
Well, it's talking about in that
What? Well, it's obviously an inhibitory factor. I mean, the fact that you get a lot of performances tending to be moved. I mean, for instance, Easter plays were moved to Corpus Christi, weren't they, at one stage? It tended to be moved to Corpus Christi. I mean, a tendency to move things to the warmer months was. Didn't this happen at one stage? I thought this happened with miracle plays. They tended to earlier, weren't they, clustering around Easter, and then they tended to move to Corpus Christi later on.
This doesn't work so well with Scandinavia because the festival that carries the weight of Carnival is Christmas.
Yeah.
But is it on the streets?
Some of it is out indoors, but not all.
I mean, I think you see that what you're dealing with in Carnival, I mean, why the sort of mass participation, the business of opening up crevices and all this kind of thing, I mean, is that everything flows onto the streets at that time. I mean, even the life inside the house sort of flows outwards, and everything is taking place on the streets.
Well, I think this is a feeling one has of the descriptions of York, for example, with you and his wife who go through the streets on horseback. And sort of proclamations made at the four gates of the city and all the rest of it. And the same sort of thing would apply in this one example that I'd be able to find over to correction if you've got some other ones of Carnival, or rather this Shrovetide activity at Norwich. I mean, again, they are actually going through the streets.
Well, if you think Christmas mumming of Christmas things and so on, I mean, Christmas mumming, for the Irish reports of Irish Christmas mumming, I mean, until recently, it happens around you now, isn't it? Well, there's a lot of Christmas mumming plays, and they actually are coming from outside into the kitchen and performing these plays in the kitchen there, just as they are in Newfoundland. I mean, the Christmas mumming there is actually coming into the house from outside and not flowing from the house out into the streets. And it's very much, in a sense, more private kind of thing than the mass performances that one gets with miracle plays, where you've got different guilds participating, which the performance is on the street.
This isn't presumably related to something that Peter said about the withdrawal of the nobility in Italy into a kind of private carnival in the 18th century.
1718, yes.
Accompanied by a large shift in the climatic cycle.
Well, I mean, there are all sorts of factors that are related to the calendrical, the clustering of calendrical rites, which is extremely important. I mean, one of them is a historical traditional fact. I mean, in most prophetic religions, the imprint of the life of the prophet is on the year, and there is bound to be some clustering. I mean, it's not randomly distributed throughout the year.
Yes, when on the one hand we have evidence from a film showing Carnival actually taking place in the snow, and secondly we have evidence for activities which are out of doors, although they're not Carnival, at the similar times of the year, I think that really invalidates the point.
No, I was about to say that there were different factors in this, and one of them was the ecological factor of clustering ceremonies at solstices and various times of this kind.
Well, I feel pretty sceptical about that.
Why is that ecological, Jack?
Well, I meant to do with astrological features. I mean, it was external to the. I mean, it's related to. I mean, part of it's related to the beginning and end of the productive year.
So it's striking when I looked at the Indian academic calendar, the Indian agricultural calendar is much easier to equate to the ritual cycle than it is in Europe. And it seems to me the European harvest cycle or the agricultural year doesn't really influence the ritual cycle as much. I mean, I think this comes back to Mr. Bossy's point. I cannot get away from the fact that there's something else involved.
I thought that the Spanish films were over trying to make the point that this would be agricultural rights, and some were, but most weren't.
Would it interest just to be told that in Sanskrit language again, there are two distinct words. One, kala, which refers to time, it means time, and the other is tithi. If I were to write it in English, I would write T-I-T-H-I, which is sacred time. Kala is divided into equal bits, and these equal bits go up to almost the level of the second or even smaller fractions. That is, like the like the way we keep time now. But tithi is unequal in length. Certain tithis last longer than others, and you could really get into a terrible mess with the gods if you observed a particular brata, that is a festival based on a vow and penance, shorter and longer than the duration of the tithi. Secondly, a very large corpus of medieval texts, shastras, Smriti shastras, exist precisely in defining tithis, which tithis last how long and what you should do when. Raghunandan's famous, the famous Bengali or Eastern Indian lawgiver of the 16th century, one of his major works is called Tithi Tattam, that is the theory of tithis. The sort of big publishing business of Panjikas, we call it. It is ephemerides, is there a word? Yes. Yes. There's a sort of kind of literature about that. Every year, various organizations bring this out, and this is the purpose of this publication has been, ever since the British came, incidentally, to identify the tithis and identify and prescribe the rites that should go with it. All I'm saying that in at least Indic culture, these two terms, time, let us say natural time, and sacred time, are clearly differentiated. It is also enshrined into the prescription that is that should be the ideal, according to the Shastras, that should be the ideal of the Brahman. The Brahman's daily routine, starting from bed up to going to bed again, including all kinds of separate ritual performances, which is given in all big Shastric texts, including the Code of Manu, is called Annik. The word Annik means, Anna means the day, and Annik means the ritual for the day, prescribed rituals for the day for the twice-born, but for the Brahmin. In other words, there is an attempt in this culture to differentiate natural time from ritual time, and ritual time again at two levels. One is public rituals, and that time is called tithi. Another is the daily ritual, which is prescribed for a good Brahmin to live up to, and that is called Annik. And there are also books, a book by the same author, Raghunandan, is called Annika Tattva, Theory of Anniks.
I wonder if we might turn perhaps from the question of time to that of place. The great carnivals which Peter Bourke described are all, of course, in large cities. Should we regard Carnival as essentially an urban phenomenon?
I wanted to ask a question about that in terms of evidence. And given that they do seem to be in cities, and presumably, I don't know, one has more continuous evidence about the life of Rome, for example, than one does about the countryside in early medieval periods. What kind of evidence is there, does anybody know, about the continuity of civic life or civic ritual in the large cities of southern Europe during the period prior to that we're talking about? Or is there no evidence that one can draw upon? So if I were to extrapolate from my alien culture carnivals, which are Islamic, Swahili urban, there, once again, they seem to be very urban expressive, balancing one location of the town against another, very linked initially with patronage. You get again the withdrawal of the aristocracy, but initially they're very concerned, so it seems, with integrating people into loyalty associations which are not those of the commoners against the aristocracy, or not those on grounds of kin or ethnicity. And I would have been tempted, as one always is, to read one's own data into other. I would have been tempted to see something of this in the material that one's getting for Renaissance cities in southern Europe. I noticed that your full quotation from Goethe was interestingly worded. I think that he still said, didn't he, now the carnivals are provided for the people. Wasn't it something?
No, but they're not something provided for the people, but something the people give themselves.
This is what's now happened. In the past, they...
No, he doesn't have a historical thesis. He just says this is how it is.
But I'm wondering really whether this whole aspect of the southern city with the patricians, with, in a sense, clientages, the economic aspect of Carnival, who pays for it. You say that there doesn't seem to be a distribution of wealth, but I wonder whether there isn't an element of this. You tend to get it in other contexts other than the Swahili one. For example, the slave carnivals in Jamaica in the 18th century, where one set of slaves parades as Scots, the other set of slaves parades as English. And if one was to start to interpret this without knowing that their patrons and paymasters are Scots and English settlers, one would be taken rather far afield. So I'm wondering whether the carnival can't be set in the context of a particular kind of urban life, rather than, or additionally to, the context that we've been looking at.
Two comments. One, that there is evidence of a lot of people who don't live in towns coming into particular towns for Carnival, notably Rome and Venice. In the case of Nuremberg, there are references to the local peasants coming in to watch proceedings. So in a sense, it looks as if the very flourishing of these urban carnivals would have drained possible rural competitors. As for who pays, the only accounts I've managed to consult are in Rome and for the 16th century, and show that the Pope was paying for the prizes for the races, but it was only costing him something like 500 scudi a year, which was chicken feed compared to his budget, so there was no redistribution. What I can't find much out about is who paid for the floats. A few 17th century floats of a particularly grand nature are said to have been paid for by Roman aristocrats. But again, I haven't got any figures as to what those floats would have set them back. And everything would now turn on just how expensive it was to mount something like that.
Isn't it true, though, that the floats were, in fact, very often an upper-class addition to carnival rituals? I mean, didn't the Medici start introducing floats with sort of classical content? Very often these floats are rather sophisticated things with allegorical significance and so on, and they could only have been put together by rather educated people.